Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolutely fascinating history of Uruguay. Seriously, if you want a masterclass in how a nation can survive extreme, whiplash-inducing pendulum swings and still forge a resilient, modern democracy, this is it. It's so often overshadowed by its massive South American neighbors, but Uruguay has a hidden history that is every bit as compelling. Over the next few minutes, we're going to see exactly how a land torn apart by fierce civil wars, transformed into a global pioneer of social progress, faced some incredibly dark descents, and ultimately fought to reclaim its democratic spirit. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive right into the central mystery here. How exactly did a nation historically squeezed right between the geopolitical giants of Brazil and Argentina become such a progressive powerhouse? Well, it's a story of constant, relentless reinvention. The path definitely wasn't linear. It swung back and forth, almost like a giant pendulum, moving between chaos and order, oligarchy and welfare, dictatorship and deep, profound democratic reform.
Just think about this staggering contrast for a second. Back in 1870, this tiny nation had only 343,000 inhabitants, yet it transformed into one of the wealthiest economies on the entire globe. Fueled by a wave of European immigration and a booming agricultural sector, Uruguay punched way above its weight class. It actually became the second Latin American country in foreign investment per capita. Incredible, right?
So, to understand how they achieved that incredible feat, our explainer is going to follow Uruguay's story through 6 main chapters: origins and independence, forging a nation through war, the rise of Batllismo, economic collapse and dictatorship, reclaiming democracy, and finally, modern challenges.
Starting us off, Chapter 1, Origins and Independence, the Crucible of Creation.
Long before Spanish and Portuguese colonization turned the whole region into this massive geopolitical tug-of-war, the land belonged to distinct indigenous societies. You had the Guarani, who were agricultural traders, and the Charrua, who lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. Tragically, as the modern nation-state grew, there was no harmonious integration. These populations were systematically marginalized, essentially erased as autonomous groups, though their legacy definitely remains an integral, if often overlooked, part of Uruguay's DNA.
Getting to a sovereign state was, frankly, an incredibly messy 2-decade ordeal. Spurred on by the American and French revolutions, military leader José Gervasio Artigas spearheaded the early anti-colonial revolts around 1811. What followed was just a tangled web of sieges and shifting powers, which finally culminated in the 1825 Declaration of Independence. By 1830, after formal recognition by neighboring Brazil, Uruguay signed its first constitution. But, as we know, a constitution on a piece of paper doesn't magically translate to peace on the ground.
Which brings us to Chapter 2, Forging a Nation Through War, the Age of Chaos.
The new republic instantly fractured into 2 totally irreconcilable factions that would end up defining its political landscape for over a century: the Colorados and the Blancos. The Colorados, or Unitarians, pushed hard for a centralized government radiating out of Montevideo. The Blancos, the Federalists, fought for local authority and a decentralized system. And these weren't just polite political disagreements in a boardroom. These were fierce, opposing visions that clashed in open, bloody warfare.
This friction basically exploded into the Guerra Grande, or Great War, spanning from 1839 to 1851. It was a devastating period. We're talking famine, cholera, and absolute despair for a besieged Montevideo. Yet, paradoxically, it was exactly this crucible of intense suffering that ultimately bonded the population. The desperate need to save public institutions amid all that devastation forged a fierce, shared sense of Uruguayan nationalism that somehow transcended the deep polarization.
And that shared identity paves the way for Chapter 3, the rise of Batllismo, the Golden Age. Starting around 1903, under the incredibly visionary leadership of José Valle Ordóñez, Uruguay's classical liberalism evolved into this fierce focus on social justice. They rolled out breathtaking, European-style welfare reforms. We're talking the 8-hour workday, state insurance, comprehensive public health systems, and even free public baths and beaches. This radical wave of progress created a massive state-supported middle class, completely cementing Uruguay's reputation worldwide as the Switzerland of America. But remember that pendulum? It always swings back. Chapter 4, Economic Collapse and Dictatorship, the Dark Descent. The crazy thing about that Golden Age wealth, it was incredibly fragile. An overwhelming 94% of the country's total exports during this period consisted of literally just 2 commodities:
beef and wool. This intense concentration meant that Uruguay's booming, progressive welfare state was entirely at the mercy of international commodity prices. So when the Great Depression hit, the floor just fell out. International wool prices collapsed, and Uruguay's GDP plummeted by more than one-half, 50%. Between 1930 and 1940, beef exports dropped to a tenth of their previous volume. This catastrophic economic decline totally undermined the previously robust welfare state, leading to severe stagnation, skyrocketing unemployment, and a deeply, deeply fractured society. You can imagine the whiplash. This economic despair created a total pressure cooker. The legendary civic culture that had defined Uruguay for decades began to unravel. In March 1973, escalating economic desperation and political tensions culminated in a brutal military dictatorship. The armed forces intervened, dissolved the parliament, and ushered in a really dark period of military rule, marked by severe human rights violations and the total suppression of civil liberties.
But here's where that historic resilience kicks in. This horror was met with an incredibly brave underground resistance. Many Uruguayans were forced into exile, particularly over in Buenos Aires, where they just flat out refused to let the democratic spirit die. Through art, literature, radio broadcasts, and political cartoons, exiles maintained a relentless, sly resistance against the regime. It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest political climates, creativity and truth are weapons that can absolutely keep hope alive.
That unbreakable spirit leads us to Chapter 5, Reclaiming Democracy, the Modern Rebirth.
Now, getting back to democracy in the mid-1980s wasn't just flipping a switch. It was a fraught, delicate balancing act. It started with the 1984 elections, which were heavily overshadowed by fear and a highly controversial pact of silence, an amnesty law designed to exclude human rights violators from prosecution. While this allowed for a formal return to civilian rule in 1985, it took decades of sustained, courageous mobilization by everyday citizens and civil society groups to challenge this impunity and demand genuine justice.
If we zoom out and look at the political landscape of the modern era, we see a massive historical shift. For over a century, those traditional Colorado and Blanco parties dominated. But following intense economic crises at the turn of the millennium, voters pivoted. In the early 2000s, they elected the Broad Front, or Frente Amplio, a progressive left-wing coalition. This brought a renewed focus on social dialogue, welfare expansion, and national development pacts, representing a major evolution in Uruguay's political identity.
All right, final chapter, Chapter 6, Modern Challenges, Ecology and Economy.
Today, Uruguay has successfully stabilized, but it's dealing with some stark 21st century realities. They're actually running a pretty serious ecological deficit. The average citizen requires 10.3 hectares of biologically productive land, but the country only has 7.9 available per person. This deficit is being fueled by the rapid expansion of mega dairies and aggressive agribusiness practices, replacing native woods with monocultures and heavily relying on pesticides, which now seriously threaten the country's long-term environmental health.
And that environmental strain? It's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The nation is actively grappling with urban sprawl, taxing its infrastructure to the absolute limit. Economically, it's navigating incredibly complex and often frustrating dynamics within the Mercosur trade bloc as it tries to expand its global market reach. And socially, it has to manage a massive boom in tourism from Argentina and Brazil, trying to offset the heavy seasonality of its coastal resorts without losing its unique, laid-back charm.
From fierce civil wars to a pioneering welfare state, and from the depths of dictatorship to a vibrant democratic rebirth, Uruguay proves time and time again that national destiny is never fixed. It's always a work in progress. So I'll leave you with this to think about. As global climate and economic pressures mount for all of us, what can your own country learn from Uruguay's relentless ability to correct its course? How will this incredibly adaptable nation swing the pendulum next to overcome the challenges of tomorrow? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.